Exhausted fighting bull saved from deadly python attack. The heat was already brutal at 6 in the morning when Danny Chen found the bull. The sun hung low and red over the scrubland of Cape York Peninsula, turning the dust to gold and casting long shadows across the dried creek bed where the massive Brahman had collapsed. Danny had been tracking the bull for 3 days, following the trail of destruction through broken fences and trampled bush, knowing that every hour that passed made recovery less likely. The bull was named Titan, and he'd earned that name. 2 years old, nearly 900 kilos of pure muscle and aggression, he'd been Danny's prize breeding prospect until 5 days ago, when a bushfire had swept through the western paddocks of Lakefield Station. The fire had started from a lightning strike, moving fast through the tinder-dry grass, and in the chaos of evacuation, Titan had broken through 3 fences and disappeared into the wild country beyond the property boundaries. Danny had grown up on this station, 4th generation to work the harsh Cape York land, where crocodiles ruled the waterways and wild pigs tore up the earth. At 38, he'd seen just about everything the top end could throw at him. But finding Titan like this, collapsed in the dirt with his sides heaving and foam crusting around his mouth, made Danny's stomach clench with worry. The bull had run himself to exhaustion. Danny could see it immediately. Titan's cream-colored hide was caked with mud and ash. His eyes were glazed and unfocused, and his breathing came in ragged gasps that shook his entire frame. The animal had probably run for days without stopping, driven by pure panic from the fire, until his body simply couldn't continue. Danny approached slowly, speaking in the low, calm voice he'd learned from his grandfather. "Easy there, big fella. Easy now. You've had a rough time of it, haven't you?" Titan's head turned slightly at the sound, but he didn't have the energy to stand or even bellow a warning. That alone told Danny how bad things were. A healthy Brahman bull would have been on his feet and charging at the first sign of a human. This bull could barely lift his head. Danny pulled his satellite phone from his belt and called back to the station. His wife Sarah answered on the second ring. "Found him," Danny said. "Creek bed about 40 k's northwest of the bore. But Sarah, he's in a bad way. Completely knackered. I'm going to need the vet. And we're going to need the cattle trailer with the winch. He's not walking out of here on his own." "How bad?" Sarah's voice was tight with concern. She knew as well as Danny did that Titan represented years of careful breeding and a significant investment for their small operation. Dehydrated, exhausted, possibly injured. Can't tell for sure without a proper examination. "Just get Pete out here as fast as possible, yeah?" Danny hung up and moved closer to Titan, assessing the damage. The bull's muscles were trembling with fatigue, and Danny could count his ribs beneath the mud-caked hide. 3 days without proper water or food in this heat would have pushed any animal to its limits. He pulled a collapsible bucket from his pack and walked to the creek bed, scooping up water from a small pool that remained in the deepest part of the channel. The water was warm and silty, but it was wet. Danny brought it to Titan and held it near the bull's muzzle. Titan's nostrils flared at the scent, and slowly, painfully, the bull began to drink. Danny made 4 trips back and forth, watching as Titan drained bucket after bucket with desperate gulps. "That's it, mate," Danny encouraged. "Get that into you. You've earned it after the run you've had." As Titan drank, Danny examined him more carefully, running his hands over the bull's body, checking for injuries, feeling for breaks or tears in the muscle. Everything seemed intact, structurally, which was a miracle given how far and fast Titan must have run. The bull's hooves were worn down to the quick. His legs were covered in scratches from pushing through scrub, but nothing that wouldn't heal with time and care. Danny was just starting to think they might actually get lucky, that they might get Titan back to the station and nursed back to health when he saw the python. It was moving through the sparse grass about 20 meters away, and it was absolutely massive. Danny had seen plenty of scrub pythons in his time on Cape York, but this one was extraordinary. Easily 5 meters long, maybe 6, as thick around the middle as Danny's thigh. its scaled body rippling with muscle as it moved with surprising speed through the underbrush, and it was heading straight for Titan. Danny's blood ran cold. He knew what he was looking at. A python this size could take down a full-grown wallaby, could kill a pig, could absolutely kill an exhausted, defenseless bull who couldn't even stand to defend himself. The snake had likely smelled Titan from a distance, had sensed an easy meal in the form of a large animal that wouldn't be able to fight back. "No," Danny said aloud, his hand going to his belt where he usually kept a knife, but his knife was in the ute, 40 meters back through the scrub where he'd parked it. He had nothing on him except his phone, the bucket, and a rope. No weapon, no way to scare off a predator that size. The python moved with purpose, its tongue flicking out to taste the air, confirming what it already knew: prey, vulnerable, and weak. Danny positioned himself between Titan and the approaching snake, spreading his arms wide, shouting and waving to try to scare it off, but the python barely slowed. It had committed to this hunt, and a single human wasn't enough to deter it. Danny watched in horror as the snake reached Titan's hindquarters and began to coil. The movement was swift and practiced, the python's body wrapping around the bull's back legs, then his middle, then his chest, each loop tightening with inexorable pressure. Titan bellowed, a sound of terror and pain that echoed across the empty scrubland, but he didn't have the strength to fight. His legs kicked weakly, his body tried to roll, but the exhaustion that had brought him down now made him helpless against the python's crushing embrace. Danny didn't think. He launched himself at the python, grabbing the thick body with both hands and trying to pull it away from Titan. The snake's scales were smooth and cool under his palms, its muscles like steel cables flexing and contracting beneath his grip. Danny pulled with all his strength, his boots digging into the dirt, his back straining, but he might as well have been trying to move a tree trunk. The python was too strong, too committed, and it wasn't about to release its prey just because a human was interfering. The snake's head swung towards Danny, its mouth opening to reveal curved teeth designed for gripping rather than tearing. Danny jerked back just in time to avoid the strike, stumbling over Titan's legs and landing hard on his backside in the dust. The python's body continued to coil, now covering most of Titan's torso, each loop tightening incrementally, cutting off circulation, making it harder for the bull to breathe. Titan's eyes were rolling with panic, his breathing becoming labored gasps as the python's coils compressed his chest. The bull's tongue lolled from his mouth, foam and saliva mixing with the dust on his muzzle. Danny could see he had minutes at most before the python crushed the life out of the exhausted animal. Danny's mind raced through options. He could run back to the ute, get his knife, but that would take 2 minutes minimum, and Titan didn't have 2 minutes. He could try to kill the snake with his bare hands, but that was suicide. Pythons this size had killed humans before, and Danny wasn't about to become another statistic. He needed something else, something the snake wouldn't expect, something that would make it choose to release Titan voluntarily. Fire. The thought came to him in a flash. The bushfire that had driven Titan into the wild in the first place. Every animal in the territory feared fire, respected it, fled from it. If Danny could create enough smoke, enough heat, the python might decide Titan wasn't worth the risk. He pulled his lighter from his pocket, the cheap plastic one he used to light his cigarettes, though Sarah had been after him for years to quit. His hands were shaking as he looked around desperately for something to burn. The grass was too sparse here in the creek bed, and what little there was wouldn't create enough smoke quickly enough. Then he saw his shirt. Danny wore a heavy cotton work shirt, long-sleeved despite the heat, because it protected against sun and scrub. He tore it off, bunching it up, and flicked the lighter. The flame caught on the third try, and the shirt began to smolder. Danny waved it near the python's head, creating as much smoke as possible, coughing as the acrid fumes filled his lungs. The python's head jerked away from the smoke, its tongue flicking rapidly, sensing danger, but it didn't release Titan. The coils tightened further, and Danny heard a terrible cracking sound. Ribs! The python was breaking Titan's ribs. "Come on, you bastard!" Danny shouted, waving the burning shirt closer. "Let him go!" But the python had invested too much effort into this kill. It wasn't going to give up easily. Danny watched helplessly as Titan's struggles became weaker, his breathing more shallow. The bull's eyes were starting to glaze over, the light fading from them. Then Danny heard it. The sound of an engine, distant, but getting closer. Sarah must have been monitoring his location on the GPS tracker they all carried out here, must have sent someone when she realized how long he'd been stopped in one place. The ute came bouncing over the rough ground, and Danny saw Pete Walsh, the local vet, behind the wheel, with Sarah in the passenger seat and two of their station hands standing in the back. "Snake!" Danny yelled, pointing. "Get the rifles!" But Pete was already ahead of him. The vet jumped out of the still-moving vehicle with a rifle in his hands, the same .22 they used for pest control around the station. He moved with practiced efficiency, circling to get a clear shot at the python's head without risking hitting Titan. "Don't move!" Pete said calmly to Danny, his eye pressed to the sight. "Keep still, both of you." The shot cracked across the quiet morning, and the python's head exploded in a spray of blood and scale. The massive body convulsed, its coils loosening reflexively as the nervous system shut down. Pete fired twice more, ensuring the snake was dead, then rushed forward with Danny to unwrap the heavy coils from Titan's body. It took all 5 of them to move the python. Even dead, it was extraordinarily heavy, its body still twitching with residual nerve impulses as they dragged it away from the bull. Titan lay gasping, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths, blood trickling from his mouth where the pressure had caused internal damage. Pete knelt beside Titan, his hands moving with the efficiency of 30 years' experience. He checked the bull's vitals, listened to his breathing, palpated his abdomen. His face grew increasingly grave. "He's got broken ribs," Pete said quietly. "At least 3, maybe 4. Possible punctured lung from the sound of that breathing. Internal bleeding, almost certainly. And that's on top of the dehydration and exhaustion. Sarah, we need to get him back to the surgery right now, or we're going to lose him." Sarah was already on her phone, coordinating with the station hands back at the homestead. They needed the cattle trailer, the one with the hydraulic lift and the padded interior they used for transporting injured animals. They needed it here within the hour, which meant whoever was driving it was going to have to push the old truck harder than it was designed to go on these rough tracks. Danny sat in the dust beside Titan, his hand resting on the bull's neck, feeling the rapid pulse beneath the mud-caked hide. The python's attack had lasted maybe 5 minutes from start to finish, but it had pushed Titan from exhausted to critical. The bull that Danny had spent 2 years raising, that represented the future of his breeding program, was dying in the dirt of a dried creek bed. "You're a fighter, mate," Danny said softly. "You survived the fire. You survived the run. You survived that bloody snake. Don't give up on me now." Titan's eye rolled to focus on Danny's face, and in that moment, Danny saw something that made his throat tighten. Recognition. Despite everything, despite the pain and the fear and the exhaustion, Titan knew him, knew he was trying to help. The bull's breathing slowed slightly, becoming marginally less panicked. Pete was setting up an IV line, pumping fluids into Titan's system, trying to stabilize him enough for transport. "Talk to him," Pete said to Danny. "Keep him calm. His heart rate's through the roof, and that's making the internal bleeding worse. If we can keep him relaxed, we might be able to slow it down." So Danny talked. He told Titan about the station, about the cool shed where they'd take him, about the sweet molasses feed they'd give him once he was strong enough to eat. He told him about the cows that were waiting, about the calves he'd sire, about the long, lazy days in the good paddock with plenty of water and shade. The cattle trailer arrived 53 minutes later, kicking up a dust cloud that Danny could see from 2 kilometers away. The station hands, brothers named Tom and Jack Mitchell, had pushed the old truck to its limits, and Danny could hear the engine knocking from the strain, but they'd made it, and that was all that mattered. Getting Titan into the trailer was a delicate operation. The bull was too weak to stand on his own, and his injuries meant they couldn't just drag him up the ramp. They used the hydraulic lift, positioning a canvas sling under Titan's body with infinite care, trying not to jar his broken ribs or put pressure on his damaged internal organs. Titan groaned throughout the process, a low, agonized sound that made Danny's chest ache. The journey back to the station took nearly 2 hours on the rough tracks, Pete driving with excruciating care to avoid jostling Titan more than necessary. Danny rode in the back of the trailer with the bull, monitoring his breathing, adjusting the IV drip, talking constantly in that low, soothing voice. Sarah sat up front with Pete, coordinating with the Emergency Livestock Veterinary Service in Cairns, arranging for specialist equipment and potentially a surgical team if Titan's condition deteriorated further. By the time they reached Lakefield Station, word had spread throughout the Cape York cattleman community. The radio chatter had been constant, everyone following Titan's story, the exhausted fighting bull who'd survived fire, exhaustion, and a python attack. 3 neighboring station owners had driven over to offer assistance, bringing equipment and expertise. Old Bill Henderson from Musgrave Station had brought his portable ultrasound machine, and young Emma Price from Laura had brought specialized antibiotics she'd just received for her own herd. They set up in the largest shed on the property, the one with concrete floors and good lighting that Sarah used for her vegetable packing business during harvest season. Pete had converted one corner into a makeshift veterinary surgery, with Titan positioned on a thick bed of straw, surrounded by monitors and medical equipment that looked almost absurdly high-tech in the rustic setting. The ultrasound confirmed Pete's fears. Titan had 4 broken ribs, one of which had punctured his left lung. There was significant internal bleeding, and his liver showed signs of trauma from the python's crushing force. Pete stood back from the monitor, wiping his hands on his jeans, his face drawn and tired. "I'll be straight with you, Danny," Pete said. "I've treated a lot of animals in my career, but this is beyond my skill level. He needs surgery, proper surgical facilities, a team of specialists. And even then, his chances are maybe 50-50 at best. The trauma is just too extensive." "What are you saying?" Danny asked, though he already knew. He could see it in Pete's eyes, in the sympathetic looks from the other cattlemen gathered around. "I'm saying we should consider putting him down," Pete said gently. "It would be quick, painless. He wouldn't suffer any more. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let them go with dignity." Danny looked at Titan, at the massive bull who'd fought so hard to survive, who'd run through fire and exhaustion and a python attack and was still breathing, still fighting. The bull's eye found Danny's, and in that moment, Danny saw something that made his decision crystal clear. Titan wasn't ready to give up. Despite everything, despite the pain and the trauma and the odds stacked against him, the bull wanted to live. "No," Danny said firmly, "we're not giving up on him. What do we need to do to give him a chance?" Pete looked at Sarah, who nodded. "The surgical team from Cairns can be here by tonight if we charter a plane," she said. "It'll cost us everything we've saved, maybe more, but we can do it." "Then do it," Danny said. "Charter the plane. Get the team, whatever it takes." The surgical team arrived at 8 that evening. 3 specialists who'd been pulled away from their comfortable Cairns practices to perform emergency surgery on a bull in a shed in the middle of Cape York. Dr. Helen Cartwright, the lead surgeon, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd spent 20 years working with large animals. She examined Titan with practiced hands, reviewed the ultrasound images, and nodded slowly. "It's possible," she said. "Not probable, but possible. The lung puncture is repairable, and if we can stop the internal bleeding, his youth and strength might be enough to pull him through." But I need everyone to understand that this is extremely risky. We're talking about major surgery on an already critically compromised animal in less than ideal conditions. The odds are not in our favor. He's fought this hard to survive, Danny said. The least we can do is give him a fighting chance. The surgery began at 9:30 and lasted through the night. Danny, Sarah, and Pete took turns assisting the surgical team, following instructions, providing extra hands when needed. The other cattlemen stayed too, keeping watch, brewing endless pots of coffee, maintaining the generators that powered the surgical lights and monitors. Danny watched as Dr. Cartwright worked with swift, precise movements, her hands steady despite the unconventional operating theater. She repaired the punctured lung, located and cauterized the internal bleeding, set the broken ribs with surgical wire that would dissolve as they healed. Her team worked in perfect synchronization, anticipating her needs, monitoring Titan's vital signs, adjusting medication levels as his blood pressure fluctuated dangerously. At 3 in the morning, nearly 6 hours after the surgery began, Dr. Cartwright stepped back and pulled off her surgical gloves. Her scrubs were soaked with sweat and blood, her face pale with exhaustion, but there was a small smile on her lips. "He made it through," she said. "The next 48 hours are critical. If he can fight off infection and his body can handle the trauma of the surgery on top of everything else he's been through, he might actually survive this." Danny felt his knees go weak with relief. He wanted to sink to the floor, to cry, to laugh, to do all the things he'd been holding back for the past 12 hours. But instead, he just walked to Titan's side and placed his hand on the bull's massive head. "You did it, mate," he whispered. "You're the toughest bastard I've ever seen." The first 24 hours were touch and go. Titan's temperature spiked twice, indicating infection, and Pete had to adjust his antibiotic regimen 3 times to find the right combination. The bull's breathing was labored, each breath a visible struggle. And there were moments when Danny thought they were going to lose him despite all their efforts, but Titan kept fighting. On the second day, his temperature stabilized. On the third day, he opened his eyes and actually seemed to focus on his surroundings. On the fourth day, he drank water on his own, his tongue lapping weakly at the bucket Danny held for him. Small victories, incremental progress, but progress nonetheless. Dr. Cartwright stayed for a week, monitoring Titan's recovery, adjusting his treatment plan, teaching Danny and Pete the specialized care the bull would need in the months ahead. She'd seen a lot in her career, she told them on her last evening, but she'd never seen an animal fight as hard as Titan had. The bull's will to live was extraordinary, almost defiant in the face of odds that would have killed most animals twice over. "You've got something special here," she told Danny as they stood beside Titan's recovery pen. "This bull's story, his survival, it's going to inspire people. You should share it." Danny hadn't planned on sharing anything. He was a private man, uncomfortable with attention, preferring to let his work speak for itself. But Sarah had other ideas. She'd been documenting Titan's recovery on social media, posting updates and photos that had caught the attention of agricultural journalists and animal welfare organizations. Within 2 weeks, Titan's story had gone viral across Australia and beyond. The media called him the Miracle Bull. News crews came from Brisbane and Sydney to film him. School groups wrote letters wishing him well. Other cattlemen from across the territory came to visit, to see for themselves the bull who'd survived the impossible. And through it all, Titan continued to heal, gaining strength day by day, his personality emerging as his body recovered. 3 months after the python attack, Titan stood on his own for the first time. Danny had been in the pen, checking his feed, when the bull simply decided he'd had enough of lying down. With a grunt of effort that made his whole body tremble, Titan pushed himself to his feet, swaying dangerously for a moment before finding his balance. Danny froze, afraid that any sudden movement might cause Titan to fall, but the bull held steady. He took 1 step, then another, each movement careful and deliberate but determined. "That's it, mate," Danny breathed, tears pricking his eyes. "That's it. You've got this." By the 4th month, Titan was walking regularly, building up the muscle mass he'd lost during his ordeal. His ribs had healed cleanly, the surgical wire dissolving as designed, and his lung function had returned to nearly normal. The scars from the python's coils remained, permanent marks etched into his cream-colored hide, but they'd become badges of honor rather than signs of trauma. The psychological recovery took longer than the physical. Titan was wary now in ways he hadn't been before, startling at unexpected sounds, uncomfortable in enclosed spaces, anxious when separated from Danny for too long. Pete explained it was a form of PTSD, that animals could experience trauma responses just like humans. They worked with Titan gently, rebuilding his confidence, showing him he was safe, that the nightmare was over. 6 months after the attack, Dr. Cartwright returned to Lakefield Station for a follow-up examination. She put Titan through a comprehensive assessment, checking everything from his cardiovascular function to his range of motion. When she finished, she stood back and shook her head in amazement. "I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes," she said. "He's made a full recovery, not just survived but thrived." "Danny, this bull is going to live a long, productive life." The question of whether Titan could still serve as a breeding bull had been hanging over Danny's head for months. All the investment, all the planning, all the genetic potential that Titan represented would be meaningless if the trauma had affected his ability to reproduce. But Pete's examinations showed everything functioning normally. And when they introduced Titan to a small group of cows, his natural instincts kicked in without hesitation. Titan's first calf was born 11 months after the python attack, a perfect heifer with her father's cream coloring and intelligent eyes. Danny named her Hope, and she became the foundation of a new breeding line that Danny called the Survivor Bloodline. Word spread about Titan's genetics, about the strength and resilience he'd demonstrated, and suddenly cattlemen from across Australia wanted access to his breeding. But Titan's legacy extended beyond genetics. His story had touched something deep in people, cattlemen and city dwellers alike. He represented resilience, the refusal to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. Schools used his story in their curriculum, teaching children about perseverance and the power of not giving up. Animal welfare organizations pointed to him as an example of why fighting for animals' lives mattered, why that extra effort, that extra expense, that extra care could make all the difference. Danny found himself giving talks at agricultural conferences, something he never would have imagined doing. He'd stand in front of hundreds of people and tell Titan's story, from the bushfire to the exhaustion to the python attack to the miraculous recovery. And every time he'd see the same thing in the audience's eyes: inspiration, hope, the recognition that sometimes the things we fight hardest for are the things most worth saving. 2 years after the attack, Danny stood at the fence of Titan's paddock, watching the big bull graze peacefully in the late afternoon sun. Titan was 4 years old now, in his absolute prime, the undisputed king of Lakefield Station. His herd of cows grazed nearby, several of them already heavy with his calves. The scars from the python were still visible on his hide, but they'd faded to silver lines that caught the light. Sarah came to stand beside Danny, slipping her hand into his. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "All the money, all the stress, all those sleepless nights?" Danny thought about it. The surgery alone had cost them nearly their entire savings. The months of intensive care, the specialized feed, the ongoing veterinary costs had pushed them to the edge financially. They'd had to take out loans, defer other expenses, make sacrifices they'd never planned on making. "Not for a second," Danny said. "Look at him, Sarah. Look at what he's become. He's not just a bull anymore. He's proof that fighting for what matters is always worth it." Titan lifted his head at that moment, as if he'd heard Danny's words. The bull looked directly at them, his dark eyes calm and knowing, and Danny could have sworn he saw gratitude there. Recognition of what had been done for him. Acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between man and animal during those desperate days of fighting for survival. "You know what Pete told me last week?" Danny continued. "He said that in all his years as a vet, he's only seen a handful of cases where an animal's will to live made the difference between survival and death. He said most animals, when they're that badly injured, they just give up. But not Titan. He said Titan wanted to live so badly that he fought past every obstacle, every setback, every reason to quit. That kind of spirit," Pete said, "that's what defines a true survivor." As the sun set over Cape York, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Titan returned to his grazing, surrounded by his herd, secure in his domain. The exhausted fighting bull who'd been saved from a deadly python attack had become something more than Danny ever expected. He'd become a symbol, a testament to resilience and the unbreakable bond between humans and the animals they care for. And sometimes, on quiet evenings like this, Danny would think about those desperate moments in the creek bed, about the python's coils tightening around Titan's body, about how close they'd come to losing everything. He'd think about the choice he'd made to fight, to refuse to give up, to do whatever it took to save one bull's life. That choice had changed everything. It had brought their community together, had inspired thousands of people, had created a legacy that would continue for generations through Titan's offspring. But more than that, it had reminded Danny of something fundamental, something he'd known in his heart but had never quite articulated, that every life has value, that every creature deserves a chance to fight, and that sometimes the greatest victories come from refusing to accept defeat even when defeat seems inevitable. Titan had been saved from a deadly python attack, but in the process, he'd saved something in Danny too. He'd saved the belief that miracles can happen, that fighting for what you love is never wasted effort, and that the strongest bonds are forged in the crucible of shared struggle and survival. The exhausted fighting bull had not just survived, he'd triumphed, and his story would be told around campfires and dinner tables across the territory for years to come, inspiring others to fight their own battles, to never give up, to believe in the possibility of miracles, even in the darkest moments. Because sometimes, Danny thought as he watched Titan disappear into the gathering dusk, sometimes the greatest gift we can give is simply the chance to fight. And sometimes that's all it takes to change everything.